This is the 6th interview of the Bauhaus Legacy Series. It is Saturday, December 13th, 2025, and we are here at the subject's residence in Lincoln, Massachusetts. So let's begin with an introduction. What is your name?
Douglas Adams. F. Douglas Adams is what I go by professionally.
And what is your current profession?
Architect.
And when and where were you born and raised?
I was actually born courtesy of the Second World War in Salina, Kansas, although my family was very much of a New England background. So I was born in 1945 at the edge of an air base.
Okay, so your dad was in the military?
Dad was in bombing technology.
And where do you currently reside?
I live in Lincoln.
Lincoln,
not
Massachusetts.
far from the Gropius House, of which we'll be talking.
Yes.
To my great pleasure and delight.
And you happen to have a very fascinating family lineage. I know that you're descended from not just one, but two U.S. presidents, as well as a very prominent local modernist architect. Can you talk about those relations?
Certainly. They would all want me to be brief, I think, but John Adams was tourist and has received some celebrity as the father of the American Revolution. By David McCullough in his prominent book, John Adams. And he had a son, John Quincy Adams, who was famous for what became known as the Monroe Doctrine, because he was the Secretary of State under Monroe, and then he was the 5th president, the first father-son presidency. They both did a good job, were not highly popular, were not politically very nimble, and so they retired from any presidential interest. And John Quincy was a statesman for much of his life and died on the floor of the Congress.
And what was your relation to them?
And they would have been great-great-great-great-grandfather for John. John Quincy, knock off one great. So a little diminution.
And tell us about your architectural lineage.
And then my uncle was an architect who was prominent less for his architecture than for his land use, because he did literally on his own overlay mapping of a substantial part of the town of Lincoln where we reside. And Quincy did a terrific job of assessing wetlands before they were legally protected to the extent they now are, and dealt with access and probabilities for fire control and things like that in this forested town. And so he was very much working on his own and really brought to life the Conservation Commission for the town. And it's a great inheritance.
And his name was John Quincy Adams as well.
Yeah. Well, every generation we tend to cycle through the names yet again.
And he has a number of modernist structures here in Lincoln that still stand?
Over near Fairhaven Bay is surrounded, which edges on the Walden Woods reservation. There's land that he actually owned that had been his grandfather's, and that's the land that he helped save and permanently preserve. Sold a substantial amount of acres to the state.
And we will get into this in much more depth, but could you just briefly describe your connection to Walter Gropius and his family?
Well, I've been very much looking forward to this effort to try to bring back alive Ise and Walter, which I knew when I was a boy of about 14 was when I first spent some time getting to know them and vice versa. Largely because my aunt had given me some books on the work of Frank Lloyd Wright, and I learned how to do renderings and proceeded to copy some of the images in the Frank Lloyd Wright books. which it's very amusing to think of a young man showing those to Walter, knowing what he stood for architecturally. But he was very generous in his interest in sort of talking about them in a rather gentle and intriguing way. He was a very kind, very strong human presence. And as my recollection is quite strong. And then Ise was a devoted chronicler of everything Gropius. And indeed, one of the interesting themes with their life together is how critical her being married in 1927. They were shortly to go to England, and Walter spoke very broken English and was very dependent on Ise for translation of his papers and for lectures where he was invited to speak, which aided his early career in England.
And as you mentioned, they live nearby, actually just down the road here, right? Just a few minutes drive at most, probably. So you were going there as a child. You knew them. You were very young.
It was really my parents who would have been the first friends. How they first met, I'm not sure, but I think there was an effort to socialize and introduce these refugees who had come to this town. So my dad was a very good horseman, which was a passion of Walter's. And in some way, they started conversing about things and became more friendly. And then my father asked me to join them to go over and have tea with the Gropiuses one day. And from that ensued an occasional trip over the next 4 or 5 years, which was a pleasure.
So we'll get more into that later. There's a wealth of information. But before we do, I'd like to go back to your background and sort of set the stage, getting into your architecture career. So let's talk about your education a little bit. What is your educational background? What did you study and where?
Well, a big influence on me was the Cordovan Museum, which is a small museum in this town of Lincoln, which was a gift to the town by the Cordova family. And I took art classes there, really under the instigation of my mother, and befriended a bunch of peers, and we did mainly boat drawings, as I recall it. So that was the first introduction in the arts. And then I went to a school called Middlesex School after going through junior high school here in the town of Lincoln in public education. And there was a very good art instructor called Loring Coleman, who's the way of a New England regionalist of some distinction. And so I worked with him, received the benefit of his criticism purely on a visit to his studio, which he had in the administration building in Concord, where the school was located. And he just left it open for various people who wanted to come up late in the afternoon and after sports and paint or do something. So that's what I did.
Okay, and where did you do your
and then
college and university?
My upper level education is Harvard College, where Bachelor of Art in architecture, or I think they call it visual arts. And then I went on to the GSD, the Graduate School of Design, and I was there and did some teaching on that, joined as a junior member of the faculty, really a teaching assistant.
What year did you start at the GSD?
I started the GSD in 68.
Okay, so Gropius at that point was long gone. I think he left in 52, right? So this was under Joseph Louis Sert was the dean at the time?
Exactly.
Okay. And you mentioned that you had gotten that book of about Frank Lloyd Wright when you were quite young. Is that what inspired you to become an architect?
Very much so.
It sounds like you may have been a little interested prior to that to inspire that as a gift.
Yeah, exactly so. It was just something that was an aptitude that got a little nourishment at an opportune time without any real structure to it other than the incidental comment of whoever I might be showing things to, which is a good way to learn.
Do you think your interest in architecture came, at least in part, from your uncle, John Quincy Adams?
Yes, he was a terrific yachtsman, had a New York 30, and I took up making boat models partly under his aid, carving wood boats. I started doing that when I was in high school.
And you see a parallel between the boat design and building design?
Yes, yeah.
Now, you mentioned also that your father had shared your drawings with Walter Gropius when you were a young teenager, I guess?
Right. I must have been, I think, about 13 or 14 when I first showed Walter and Ise the drawings.
Do you remember that moment? How did that feel?
I do. And I remember, I mean, one of the things that is a piece of the genius of the McCarthy book is that
I'm sorry, that's the Fiona McCarthy's
book on Walter Gropius,
yeah.
is that she finds in history events, and what she seems to be is describing events, some pretty horrific relative to the events in the First World War, and then they sort of seep into an overlap with the understanding of the humanity of the individual she's describing and enrich the sense of who this was, because usually there's an observer she's quoting. And there's a nice one about Lionel Feininger about the drawing he did for the founding of the Bauhaus. And he said, Walter looked at the drawing and his eyes lit up like the radiance of the night sky. And that's the way I thought of it, as somebody who turned to focus and rather calmly sort of seemed to deliberate about something and then would articulate whatever was on his mind. So I think that was the role he played in much of his life, of providing direction for people in leadership. And of course, I think some of the time there was some tension about that. For instance, in his partnership with Breuer in the 40s. They're both teaching at Harvard, and Breuer takes an offense to a junior faculty member. It's something that Walter does, and says he doesn't want to work with him anymore. And so that becomes the end of their relationship architecturally. But they went on to renegotiate their friendship, and as things went forward.
Did you feel, when you showed your drawings to Walter for the first time, did you feel intimidated having someone of his caliber look at them?
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
I was just gratified that he had any interest in them, and very aware that this was not something he would do daily, but he was doing as sort of a courtesy and a support.
One of the things I've heard about him, including from a few of the folks that we've interviewed, had mentioned how good he was with kids and that he was genuinely interested in what kids had to offer. Did you get that sense?
I think he was very, very interested in how kids learned. I think he had a very structural mind, and there was very few things he thought about in which he didn't create an analysis of this way things interacted in terms of the structural components that made up a line of inquiry. And that meant that he was somebody who was very helpful in terms of, getting input on one's work. A very good critic. When somebody I trained at, it was one of the Boston City Hall architects, was Gerhard Kallmann, who won the award when he was in his 40s, and his young partner was Michael McKinnell, who was only 28. But they're both very gifted architects. But Gerhard had a sort of a generosity in his criticism, and associated with your work with other architecture in a way which any student could only find flattering.
Well, that leads into my question, actually, which was, how did Walter Gropius respond to it? Was it purely just supportive, or did he give you some meaningful criticism, constructive feedback?
Actually, if my recollection is right, and it could well be that it's not absolutely precise, but I remember the general gist of the Frank Lloyd Wright. It was a crossing where, in Wright's work, he tended to have a roof that stepped up and had skylights or glazing, bringing in high light near the chimney mast, and so you had shadows and light and dark articulating around a vertical element as it cast shadows also on the floor. And he said that was very interesting and helpful and artistic, and he enjoyed that. But if you really wanted to understand how this thing fit together, an isometric drawing would be something to work on. So what he did was he rather deftly took a comment he made about something I had drawn up and suggested another path of inquiry. And without asking his permission, I proceeded to do that. And I think that sustained his thoughts that at least it was worth having occasional conversations with this young person, because I think what he was seeing in that was the way you learned, and as you acquired skills, you could represent things of greater complexity.
Were there any guidance or feedback that he gave you that you feel like you integrated in your professional work later?
I think very much about site design. It was one of the things that I think distinguished our architecture as a small architectural firm, about 8 or 10 people at its largest. We did residential projects of some distinction and won some awards. And what with the interest in passive solar design and dealing with sloping sites and other environmental aspects of contemporary work, we tended to do the contouring along with the landscape architects, but we worked collaboratively so that the concepts that were binding between the two firms, which I thought was a very good way to advance things.
And did you continue to, as you grew up and then graduated high school, went to college, did you continue to go to him for feedback on any of your work?
I think I didn't. And I think that had a lot to do with the timing that Walter died in
69.
69, right? And so I'm not yet out of architecture school. So I just didn't have the time and get to it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think he was rather poorly the last 3 years of his life, if I recall correctly. I think he had some heart issues.
Now, when you were studying at Harvard's Graduate School of Design, which professors made the biggest impact on you?
Well, Kalman and McKinnell were influencers.
And I'm sorry, I believe you mentioned this, but they designed Boston's City Hall. Right?
City Hall.
Yeah.
They won 3 AIA gold medals for work in Boston, and did the American Academy of Arts and Sciences over in North Cambridge, which is a very fine design. And then I worked with really a very different field, but with somebody called John Brinkerhoff Jackson, and have actually written an article that's in a book about his landscape drawings. Where he was a very gifted, quick sketcher out of his work in reconnaissance during the Second World War, which he then kept up doing sketches the rest of his life.
And I know that has always been very important in your work, right? Is the sketching element, the drawing.
Right.
Is that something that, it sounds like you were interested in that when you were much younger, but it sounds like his influence was strong.
Up.
Yeah.
I was very lucky as a boy of 14 with my older brother, who was 4 years older in college by that time. He and his roommate and I rode through Normandy, France for about 3 weeks. And I got to do some sketches, and that was a great adventure.
And you mentioned John Brinkerhoff Jackson, who you studied under at the GSD, and I'm familiar with some of his drawings, which cover these sort of overlooked places in the American landscape, like
Right.
gas stations, even, right, or parking lots, things that people don't pay any attention to, but are part of that modern vernacular, let's say.
Right.
Did that inspire your own drawings, your own design?
Well, very
The way-
definitely, and some experience of traveling and sketching with him in the Southwest after I graduated from college and was going to the graduate school of design, where I was his teaching assistant.
I also know that you were in the program when it was chaired by Albert Szabo.
Szabo.
Szabo. And my understanding is that he had studied at the new Bauhaus in Chicago, and then also had worked under Gropius and Marcel Breuer as well. When you did you have any classes with him? Were you instructed by him at all?
I didn't have much contact with Albert. Actually, the first few years that I did architectural practice after graduating from design school, I worked with his wife in an architectural firm. And so I know that she and her husband shared an interest in the idea of the modular that Le Corbusier advanced in terms of proportional control and dimensionality in a building, which I thought is certainly dramatic how differently it represents itself in Corp's own work than the way other people managed it. But it was an interesting idea. This room actually is a golden section proportion.
And what does that mean?
It's you half a square, draw a square, go to the midpoint of the square, drop down a line to the radius from that corner, drop it down, and then the ratio is 1 to 1.69 of the size of the square and the size of the new square that you've generated. So it was going back to classical architecture where everything was geometrician.
Did you sense an influence of the Bauhaus and of Gropius's legacy, let's say, when you were at the GSD, or were times kind of moving ahead into new directions?
I think there was an influence in the Visual Arts Center was where the influence was really felt. I think MIT had a closer link in some ways to the Bauhaus in that there was a pursuit of a kind of new materiality, scientific rationality, kind of the work of Laszlo Moholy-Nagy and others were what struck the strongest link between design going forward and what they inherited.
In the sense of an embrace of newer technologies?
Yes, an interest in technology. The photogram and things like that were very much things that Moholy-Nagy advanced. And of course, the wonderful photos of the Bauhaus buildings that were done by his wife, Sybil, which are the great historic legacy we have of the original school.
And actually, as we're talking, we just mentioned your relationship with John Brinkerhoff Jackson, and now we're talking about modern technology. Do you feel that the skill of drawing for architects has over time gotten lost in the sense of focus on computer technology to design?
It certainly has. I mean, much of the representation is now all done by computers and drop-in figures and stuff. I don't really object to it in any way. It's just a different. But when you're sketching, you can do light and shadow with just the impress of the different way of putting a line on the paper. So it's a very natural, very instinctive, reflexive kind of observation about what you're trying to represent, which has a kinship with designing de novo on a new project.
Do you think that the focus on computers to design in the more modern era has changed the way buildings look?
Oh, I would imagine so, yeah. I mean, the glazing technology is so sophisticated now. And that's a nice one to relate to the Gropius House because, of course, it must be 20 years ago now that the Gropius House went through a substantial renovation, mainly because of condensation damage to adjoining wood structure around the fenestration.
So we're talking about sketching. My understanding is that Walter Gropius actually did not do much, if any, drawing in his practice. Is that correct?
Well, that's a wonderful. We'll fall into a little void here with gravity, because one of the things that always is talked about with Gropius is whether he was artistic or not, because he did not draw. I repeat that, he did not draw. He pointed with a pencil, he talked with a pencil, but he didn't draw. And he had a number of partners to his benefit, and I guess to theirs, such as Marcel Breuer and others. And I think there's an answer buried in Fiona McCarthy's book. I don't think she actually states it boldly, because I think it's just an opinion. But in the First World War, Walter is in a cavalry unit, and later becomes the head of communications branch, which was dependent on dogs to go run through the trenches carrying messages, and the training of them and the distribution of them and use of them. And Walter was in a command headquarters during 1918, I think 1917 possibly, which they were withdrawing from the Battle of the Somme, and the building took a direct hit, and he was buried alive for 3 days. And I believe, I can only imagine, from the descriptions I've read, that his limbs must have been under extreme duress, being cramped and being, have weights on them and being pinned down. And I think that's when he lost his ability to draw naturally. Or that's what I've decided to believe.
I've heard that as well. So you think that he could draw prior to the war, perhaps?
I think anybody can draw. So
Yeah.
I don't think it's not credible to me that, because he is a handsome man, a gifted horseman, and certainly if you can ride a horse at speed, you need both wrists and good hand controls.
Maybe a better question is, instead of could he draw, do you think that he did draw in his architectural work prior to the war?
That's a damn good question. I don't have the answer for that. That's, for some reason, while people who worked, even the people who attacked at some of the later parties after Walter was deceased, people would be a little snide about the fact was that Walter didn't draw, And I always thought that was an attempt to maybe bring somebody of a certain stature a little closer to the stature of the critic. I don't have the answer, but I have an opinion that, to me, provides elegant logic.
And that was actually something you said, maybe answer the question, but when he was practicing, let's say in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, was that highly unusual for an architect to not draw in their designs?
I think it probably was unusual, because usually throughout my early lifetime experience of architecture, one of the things was that if you could draw well and you were junior, you ended up working closely with the principal, usually what was called the design principal, because you could help him express the design directive and setting them quickly and with more agility than others might be able to. And that was obviously to the benefit of the project and the efficiency of delivering the commission, and getting the owners, interested in understanding the scheme.
What is the Bauhaus mean to you personally as an architect and as someone who knew Gropius personally? And I'm thinking in the sense of its impact on the world of architecture and design.
I think what the Bauhaus intended to be and sustained for a period of time was something very truly architecturally of benefit. And you can see that, I mean, the list of people who were trained by Gropius or were subject to his thought, I.M. Pei, Johansson, I mean, the list goes on and on. His partners attack, but I think that the issue that has always been, goes back even to the work of Alvar Aalto. You know, are you delivering a style of work, or are you delivering something which is continually changing and evolving? And Aalto had a good term for it, which was creative production, which allowed you to tolerate the notion of different forms, different materials juxtaposed in a way that was influenced uniquely by the designer's desire to do something, to articulate something. Baker Dorm at MIT is a classic example of a building that's filled with little moments that obviously came out of the design process and would have been awkwardly resolved in the hands of others. And Aalto made some unique spots, which has an almost a humanistic implication. So the standardization wasn't a limiting factor. Standardization was something that allowed for different developmental iterations in a real project.
You're mentioning standardization. I'm thinking of, again, this idea of hand drawing your designs versus designing on a computer, so using technology. And the Bauhaus was so forward thinking in the sense of embracing modern technology, the machine, right? Machine production, modern materials, things like that. Do you think that those innovations, this embrace of modern technology, is something that was of benefit to the architectural field as far as where it's come today?
I think so. Yeah. I think so. I mean, one of the things that, I mean, you know, because you spend some time in the Gropius House, and so you see it changing, you know, across the daytime and in different seasons of the year. It's a challenging house. I think it's not an easy house to live in. It's in a house where the openness of the plan and the fact that you have the curtain that you pull to cut that Western light and you're in the living room in the afternoon, all of those aspects of how something can be changed and adjusted and adapt are very much a part of the design discipline. And that, to the right person, is an attraction. That's not a limitation or a failure of design. And that, I think, is a very important sensibility to realize either exists in the client or doesn't. But it's in the work to contend with.
Have you ever visited the Bauhaus sites in Germany?
Never. Always wanted to.
So let's talk about your connection to the family a bit more. You've already given some great recollections on that. Do you recall the first time you ever met Walter and Ise?
You know, I don't think I have a precise recall of the event because I was just a young kid, as I figured it out now, 13 or 14 or so. I imagine I had actually met them once or twice before that because we had two big stallions and Dad would take us out riding and we'd rotate siblings. And so if you happen to be out and come across Walter riding himself, you'd exchange and you'd make some contact. So I imagine those were just very relaxed, informal contact.
So your father and Walter were got to be friends because of their horseback riding. Did they meet when Walter first moved in? I mean, your family goes back here quite a ways, right, in
I
Lincoln?
believe so.
Okay. So you mentioned they welcomed them as like the new neighbors and the
Yeah.
foreigners that were new to the area.
And I think my dad actually had a role in the preservation of both the Codman House and Gropius House. I think he had talked with Walter and Ise about the idea that they could preserve their house and the legacy that would enrich the recollection of Gropius. And I think that was, I mean, they were never wealthy. So the question of how the gift could be made and be protected and sustained was a bit of an issue. But I think my father had a role in these seeking support for that.
Oh, interesting. So
And he had been the head of the Massachusetts Historical Society.
interesting. So your father actually may have put that notion in, at least in Isa's head, when she eventually bequeathed the house to Historic New England, or Spinnea at the time.
Yeah.
Interesting. You've already spoke about this a bit, but what were Walter and Ise like as people? What were their personalities like?
Well, I mean, that's intriguing. And I remember it with such affection because it was so distinctive. In other words, I had never seen, Lincoln was a fairly simple rural town. And, before we had the war, we had a depression. So people weren't very extravagant. But Ise was always beautifully made up and, so picture perfect. And towards the end of this interview, I'll talk a little about at the very end of her life when I came and talked with her about the Convegno Volta that I found some information about because I was doing a fellowship at Brown University. What I remember about them was that the double desks that they have, which they were very proud of, as if they function as a kind of a unity, I think in their professional lives really did have a very practical aspect because Walter was limited in his English, evolved English over time. But when they moved to England, Pritchard set up classes for him to learn English. And he did achieve that, but he never became fluent in any way. And I think it was one of the torments that he suffered under the Nazi takeover of German culture, which is he was proudful of German lineage in terms of culture, and to have it terribly distorted as it was in the Second World War by fascism was, I think, deeply distressing.
And how would you describe them as far as the contrast between Walter's personality and Ise's personality?
Well, that's interesting. I think interesting. Ise was a dependent. In other words, she was promoting the Bauhaus because she was promoting Walter. But I think she was sometimes restive about the degree of constraint or misunderstanding there was about the Bauhaus, and all the big politics of it. What in the 1919 and 1920, when the Bauhaus is being created, Walter is traveling through a good part of Germany, constantly giving talks and constantly going to events and facing opposition and hostility, and proselytizing and explaining that this isn't a threat to anybody. This is just the conditions of the gestalt of modern life. And you're going to have to adjust to it because it's a change that is transforming life. And I remember talking, Siegfried Gideon wrote a book which we all read in graduate school, Mechanization Takes Command, which very interestingly in the last two republishings of it had a whole series of chapters on the work of Alvar Aalto that I loved. That was a real discovery. So the sense that there was a energy that was behind the Bauhaus that could represent itself in more natural materials and simple, non-industrial materials was an expansion of the range of the condition of fabric that you built buildings out of, which I think was not inconsistent with the Bauhaus, but it wasn't something that Bayer and people like that tended to, who were doing interesting work in typography and new materials like Nagi and photograms and such.
As you described how Walter engaged with you on your drawings, from makes me think of what I've heard about Walter, which is that he had such a warm, kind of gentle, calm demeanor, a very grounded presence, but sort of a softness to him. Given that he founded and led this incredibly innovative, groundbreaking school and had to deal with a lot of opposition from the government as well as egos within the school, it sounds like he was kind of a mild-mannered personality. How did he manage to deal with such a difficult, kind of confrontational role?
An excellent question, and I think that's one of the things that's a real resonant strain in Fiona McCarthy's book, is she implies that condition, and she talks about its effect and not about where its energy comes from or any limitation attached to it. And I think what you see in the work, Maxwell Fry, who was his partner in England for 4 years, which were 4 disappointing years for Walter, who had hoped to really be able to settle into England. But the class isolation that characterizes British culture, certainly did back then, worked against his ability to find patrons. But character of this guy was he would engage you, but fairly quietly, just as if he was a good listener. And then you would see that he really had something that was beginning to clarify that he wanted to talk. And his face would brighten up a little bit in his eyes. So it was a totally appealing sense of responsiveness to what the other party to the conversation would bring to the meeting. And so that was his one aspect of his character, which served him very well in the tasks that he took on and executed with such skill.
Sounds like the way that he engaged with people was very inspiring.
Yeah.
Yeah. And in that way, he had some charisma through his engagement with people.
Yeah, and he also had a little sense of humor. There's a story which I think everybody's heard about, Walter and Frank Lloyd Wright. But when the new Bauhaus was having a fundraiser in Chicago, Frank Lloyd Wright, as the local Chicago architect, was obviously invited. And Ise and Walter came out and it was the first time they'd met Frank Lloyd Wright. And at some point during dinner, as I understand it, about the time that the dessert course was being prepared, there was a brief silence, and Wright employed it to say, this is a perfect moment. There's a question I want to ask Mr. Gropius, which has been troubling me for some period of time. And what I'm concerned about, this is Wright speaking, is what you seek to achieve through collaboration. Is it that you would always seek somebody to aid you? For example, would you, if you were having a child, would you seek to have another party involved? And Wright Gropius thought for a moment and said, well, I'm sure I would invite my wife. So that sort of timing, hesitation, twist, re-entry of that, I think Gropius had a great sensitivity towards.
My impression between Walter and Ise, that Walter had kind of a quiet, grounded let's say, more introverted personality, but that Ise was much more outgoing. Was that your
Yes.
experience?
Yeah.
And also that her English was better. She had studied when she
Right.
was younger. Right?
And I think, one of the things, she had some profound regrets about not being able to have the children. And she was fairly clear about that. I mean, she was very devoted to her adopted daughter. They didn't have an easy relationship at various points in the adolescence, I think.
And this is Ati we're talking about.
Ati, yeah.
Did you ever meet her?
Yes.
And she was out of the house by the time you got to know the family, I would think, right?
Yes.
So you met her when she was an adult.
Right. And Ati, what was the Forberg, what was the name of her?
Oh, Charles Forberg.
Forberg. They had a daughter who was a biological child who I think was killed when she was in
Serena.
Serena.
Yeah, she was adopted, actually.
Yeah. And I think in a car accident or something.
That's right.
But she was a friend of my sister's, a younger sister who's 8 years younger than I am.
Did they go to school together?
I don't think they went to school together. I think Serena went to Concord Academy, and I think Marion Ramel went to the Lincoln schools, and then she went to Concord Academy.
Did you get to know Serena very well?
No.
No. Did you ever meet the other daughter, Erica?
No.
Okay. We actually just interviewed right before you. What was your recollection of Ati's personality?
I don't think I really knew her that well, but I thought she was sort of fun, spirited. But that sounds to me as if it was more a secondhand judgment that others had made that I was witness to. Than, I mean, Ati would have been what age relative to myself? She was born when?
In the mid-1920s.
Yeah. Yeah, so she was much older. Certainly I would have been of no interest to her, and I think vice versa.
This is kind of an open question, but I'm curious if anything comes to mind as far as just memorable kind of habits or quirks or routines about the members of that family.
Well, of course, I'm sure a bunch of people have talked about the stories of when you were over there with the Gropiuses. There'd be these moments when Ise would get up and sort of quietly cross the living room, go to the south wall where there was a gun leaning up against the door, and cock a BB gun and open the door and swing it open and shoot at the squirrels. She was a pretty good shot. I remember thinking this was kind of neat.
Were they getting in her bird feeders? Is that what?
Yeah, getting the squirrels off the bird feeder. And I think it has some effective consequence. I mean, I don't know what the behavioral modification for a squirrel is. You probably get tired of being shot at.
Did you ever have dinner over there? I'm curious what kind of food they tended to have.
I think I had lunch a couple of times.
Yeah.
And I would have said sort of cold cuts and salad.
So kind of falling into American traditions.
Yeah.
When you were at the house, did Walter and Ise speak German to each other?
Yes, very much so. And it was fun. I never spoke German, but my dad tried to encourage me to learn how to pretend I had a German accent. I think he thought it would be cute if I could replicate Walter's very distinctive, sort of deep-voiced Germanic, the emphasis of the verb at the end of the sentence. And I never attained any gift at it. So
they continued speaking German. It sounds like they at least integrated some American-style foods at home. But did they ever speak about how they felt about living in the United States? Did you ever get a sense of
that? I got a sense of that. they were actually quite keen on exploring America. So the writing that they did in Arizona was something they delighted in. And like many of the artistic community, as roads improved and vehicles improved, the trip down to the Cape Cod, and to drive down there and spend weekends or rent a place and get a bunch of friends and go down and just sort of hang out and live sort of au naturel was something that they participated in. And I think they had, I mean, their house during the war in the 40s, 42 through 45, certainly, they had constantly people coming and staying for shorter, longer times because the refugee problem was so severe, and to get people out of incarceration or temporary detainment, they needed to have a sponsor who would make sure they weren't, on the public dole. So that they participated in that very actively, I think.
And that's interesting. It's making me think, actually, they were new to this country during a time when Germans were not viewed very favorably on the world stage. Do you have any sense of prejudice they might have experienced here?
Well, there was a story that Walter was accused of being a spy. Somebody thought he was riding off with his horse in the woods, and there was a radio set or something like that. And one story has it that a member of the family, my grandfather, when this was brought up in town meeting, stood up and said, "This is the damn foolish idea I'd ever heard. This was a refugee, that we should be supporting, and they'd come here with real duress, and we were lucky to have him." So that sort of ended that rumor. That's the only thing I've ever heard. Now, the Brits in England, apparently, it was when he moved over there, and that would have been 30 through 34. There was the British Society of Architects, and apparently they actually did initiate some cautionary concern about immigrant architects coming in and taking away work from the native population.
I'm curious, given that he would have been one of the first modernists to develop in Lincoln, to build a home of that style, would have seen, because this area has a lot of old colonial New England style homes, right? How do you have a sense of how he was perceived as far as his architecture?
I think people were pretty supportive of it. It was just a much more open-ended, tolerant society. What a neighbor to you thought. I mean, I knew son, and I'm trying to remember his name right now, it's escaping me, but who lived in the colonial house that's right on the corner of Woods End Road, which goes down below the Gropius House. But that was a house that Mrs. Starrow intentionally assigned to be made in the New England vocabulary, pitched roofs and, paned windows and things of that nature. Just because she thought that as a patron that it was good to have things juxtaposed. But I don't know that it ever there was no style integration that was required.
And it's interesting because the house, as much as it probably stood out when it was first built in 1938, over time, Lincoln has become kind of a hub of modernism.
A hub of modernism, yes.
Do you think did Gropius start that by settling here?
Well, he was preceded by a guy called Carl Koch, who was a Cambridge architect. I did a project on the top of Belmont Hill, Snake Hill Road, rather a beautiful house that got published a bit. But certainly Gropius was an early architect, but to the extent you have Neutra and Frank Lloyd Wright and people like that who are doing modern design, different style aspects to it. It was early on at the outset, but I would say it's the 1930s that would have been the start of, American modernism. But I think the characteristic of the Gropius House, and of course one of the distinctions about that characteristic, which is known as the international style, to the extent stylistically appropriate to designate it, is the four elevations all look somewhat dissimilar from each other. So it's a geometrically composed architecture. So it has less volumetric limitation on what it appears to be, because it's simply, if you compare it with a traditional vernacular house, in other words, the vernacular house is a much simpler form, not as broken apart and with identifiably similar elevations, whereas the south wall and the north wall of the Gropius House really look very dissimilar from one. One has a ribbon bunch of windows, and the back has piers and large planes of roofing in the wall. So it's has a whole different feeling of enclosure.
So thinking back on the question I just asked about, did Gropius start this trend of modernism in Lincoln specifically? I'm thinking about your uncle John Quincy Adams, who was a modernist, building around that same time. Was he inspired by Gropius, having known him through your family, do you think?
I think he was paying attention to Gropius, and it's interesting because it's now 4 or 5 years ago that my office renovated a building that John Quincy had designed for a couple, and he's a chair of astronomy at Harvard.
It's just the Fairhaven House?
The Fairhaven House. And that ended up, I think we improved on it because his was a very simple masonry block house with very little adjustment of roof planes and such above the block. But we did it with controlled soffit conditions. We created much better southern protection for elevation, and we put on a thermal coating of synthetic stucco as acrylic stucco, and that gave much more energy benefit to the CMU wall, which was uninsulated, so it had a very bad R value. But once you built it into the volume and put stucco outside of it, you trap that thermal mass, and that's been an incredibly energy efficient house. And it looks very different than what it originally was designed to be, because it's got this overhanging light and shadow, and the band that wraps around, it looks almost more like a Wright building. That's what I think we were trying to learn from, create a family of form.
How did that feel, working on doing some renovations
Well,
on
it
a
was
historic
fun.
building of your own
It
relatives?
was fun. I regretted that Quincy wasn't still alive so I could come over and talk with him about it.
What do you think he would feel about the renovations?
Oh, I think he was pretty, he was very matter of fact about architecture. He took the economics and simplicity of factory production very much to heart. I mean, these were fireproof houses because they're out in these woods without any fire system. And when they were built in the 40s on sandy roads that were hard to access in the wintertime and such, with concrete slabs and light steel structure and masonry walls. So they're fairly straightforward. And one or two were better than others. I think he learned as he practiced, the way most of us do.
So it sounds like in his work, he was sort of pragmatic about the sense of being contemporary, being modern, keeping up with the necessity of changing materials, right? So it sounds like he probably would have approved of making modern adjustments to his house to continue the use of it within our current day.
Oh, I think so.
Yeah.
And I mean, one of the things you noticed immediately was the rooms were rather nicely proportioned, but the fenestration tended to be sort of symmetrical. And when you broke loose and with these views of Fairhaven Bay, and you had bigger sheets of glass, and you carried it in the ceiling plane stretched out into the bay windows that were framed larger than they had been in the original house. It really did some very nice things to the rooms. So that was a good project. I think it had some good design features.
Let's talk about the Gropius House a little more. I'm wondering, when you were starting to get into architecture yourself and you went over there, what were your impressions of the house as you were starting to see through an architectural lens? Do you recall?
Well, I remember being very impressed, actually, because but probably as an undergraduate was the first time I really had a rigorous explanation of the work of Le Corbusier, and started to understand some of the tenets of the relationship between Cubistic design and the architecture of Corbusier.
And I'm sorry, but you actually studied in Corbusier's Carpenter Center at Harvard, didn't you?
Yes, yeah, which was a wonderful building to work in. And so I think you came to an understanding of that work, that suddenly the size of openings and the things that you can subjectively control, alignments, pattern of circulation, relationships to the land, wings of the building, controlling the size of the southern exposure versus the more protected northern exposure. All those things, you learn a lot, and you're aware of learning a lot when you're new to the profession.
You've mentioned a couple of times about the use of light and the directionality, right? The placement of the house and the use of the windows. It sounds like that's one of the elements of the house that you admire quite a bit, the climatic element of it.
Yeah.
And did that inspire your own work as you designed houses in your career?
Constant learning. I mean, we were picked for a governor's design award for some passive solar housing for the elderly that we did in one of the western Massachusetts towns, where we had this whole solar access gallery, and so the whole fenestration of the project was governed by getting benefit from southern exposure. So those are good, rigorous disciplines to be exposed to.
In what ways do you see that house as being actually a distinctly New England structure?
I'm always a little intrigued by that, because I think it's as the building relates to the outside that it seems to me to be fairly New England. The sense of the small enclosures and stone walls, the landscape falling away from the house, which is on a kind of a knoll, a natural knoll that was expanded a little. Now solar design is so influenced by high levels of insulation and the very careful control of fenestration, that a New England house has a lot of different aspects, as you can see in some of the modern work, which is not overtly trying to be modernist or anything else, but just a discovery of materials and new scope and scale. And of course, we're building bigger houses now, if anything, rather than smaller houses. Whether that will persist, I'm not sure, but it's certainly the character of the time.
Do you think the simplicity and the focus on functionality in that house is a New England concept?
I think that's an attribute.
So in a way, you have this contrast here in Lincoln between all these colonial houses and then these modernist houses. But am I correct in thinking that they actually share those principles?
Those are principles, yeah. And of course, when you look at the Gropius House, one of the things that jumps out, which is a time signature to the building, is it's got a tiny little maid's quarters, and the efficiency of the modern kitchen with everything below a horizontal counter of 36 inches. Those are things that are just true to the way we make things now in terms of appliances and all that, which goes back to Frederick Winslow Taylor and time motion studies. And there was a great deal of interest in the 1950s in terms of making the efficient kitchen, to liberate the housewife was the way it was explained.
Yeah, and I know in the Gropius House, the Frankfurt kitchen design, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
There was a great quote. We can talk about this a little later, but your brother, Henry Adams, wrote a nice book about you, which you gave me a copy of to read. And there was a great passage that stuck with me where he mentioned that your grandfather described the Gropius House as sensible, quote unquote, like a New England farmhouse.
Yeah, very, very true to say.
Yeah, it's interesting to think of these two styles that are quite different and removed in time actually have this continuity in these.
And of course, that's one of the nice things about it, is that a modern house innately has more penetration of inside and outside, because you go out into the landscape and you can orient door openings and things in a way that makes for nice outside space along the edge of the house. In the original New England farmhouse, like the places of the birthplace of John and John Quincy, they were very simple along the perimeter. There tend to be patios and things of that nature. They're just simple, slate steps leading to an entry or something like that. So that's a change. But the notion of efficiency and a certain pragmatism, use of local stone and local material, that's, I think, a governing bias of the New England affect.
In Gropius's way of dealing with climate, right, in sense of using large windows for passive solar heat, for example, old colonial houses wouldn't have windows of that size, but they would have had to have been equally mindful of climate, dealing with pre-air conditioning, preheating, right?
Right.
What similarities are there between these old, let's say, 18th, 19th century farmhouses versus the Gropius House and how they dealt with climate?
Well, I'm trying to think about the house that my grandfather lived in over at Red Rail Farm, where Quincy did a nice little addition that was his home office workshop, where we used to work on model boats. And I think it was how things were oriented in the scale of windows, which is the first real adjustment that New England architects start to make, which happens in the 1870s.
Now, as an architect yourself, I know you clearly admire the Gropius House's design. Is there anything that you would have done differently?
It's interesting, I don't think I've ever given that much thought, and I think that's, I don't quite know why that is. I think one of the things as we sit in front of this big chimney, which is linked into the hallway that organizes the house, controlling those elements and linking them together somehow, and inside and outside, that's something that I think I've characterized as my work. So you get a scale of elements which have a hierarchy to them that anchors various features of the house. And Walter's house has that in the fireplace. And one of the things that always intrigued me about the fireplace is that mounted on the fireplace chimney front is, I think it's a Maholi-Nagy painting, and it's held off the wall by about an inch, and it's translucent. And so one of the huge interests of the piece of work is magnified many times because you get this sense of it changing with the light, the way it's mounted. That gives it a kind of transient interest as it changes.
What is your, if you had to pick something, what would be your favorite element of that house?
In terms of what I would change,
Or what do you admire most about it?
Well, you know, I realize that I'm captive to two very different thoughts about in response. The first thing that always intrigues me about the house is how commanding it is on the site as you pass it and see it from the public ways most often, which is to look at basically the north side of the house and the splayed geometry of the entry portico that comes off as a rather large-scale element off the mass of the house. And I think it really works very well. And part of the reason it works very well is because the fenestration or the cutting away into the facade that is anchored to is comparatively modest. In other words, the ribbon windows make a simple pattern and wrap around and find a kind of unity with this thing that branches off. And I've always thought that the entry walk and the glass block at night is very engaging. And I don't know quite how I would improve on that. I think then what I'm surprised about whenever I think about it, and I've made some point over the last few years to go by in the spring and fall to look at this, is the southern aspect, because it's pointed toward the woods, and you don't tend to be moving through that sector of the sight line looking on the site. And I think that's rather a beautiful elevation. And I'd almost wish to clear out a little more of the trees that have become quite large, so you get some of the spirit that I think Walter tried to build into the south facade. So then the east and the west are kind of interesting because they're the two facades that have some kinship with each other because they have a major window mass with an overhang, and they become a point of fairly large-scale access into the house as an alternative to the front formal entry. And I think if I were to do something to it, it would relate to how you might landscape and reduce some of the trees, cut out some of the pine trees, and so you get more light and more penetration.
And I actually know there was a big tree near that walkway on the east side of the house that was taken down not too long ago.
Yeah.
Do you think that actually helps?
It improves things.
Yeah. Is there anything else that you'd want to share about the house before we move on?
Oh, and then I've always wondered a little about, I find the planning of the bedrooms and the upstairs a little challenging relative to the access to the porch, the upper roof deck. And the roof deck, I would have liked the roof deck to be more present through the rest of the house, maybe to have some skylight shafts or something that would have brought light down into the living room. You could imagine something that penetrated through. I think Corbusier would have had that instinct, which is you've created a roof plane, now you make some sort of sculpted presence on that roof of forms, whatever they might be. And that relates then to getting a three-dimensional interpenetration.
Do you ever recall going out on that roof deck when you visited the house?
I did.
Yeah.
I remember the first time I walked out on the roof, I was elated. Because it's been always on my mind, what would it be like to be up there?
Oh, because you had seen it when you...
Yeah.
Did they have furniture out there? Did they, like, deck chairs or anything like that?
Not that I recall. I think, actually, there may have been a sort of a lounge chair. And it's interesting to think when you know that Breuer, with his Isicon lounge chair, which isn't the one in the living room.
Mm-hmm.
I think so. And I remember Ise had a little throw rug there on the Isicon. And she said that she took naps down there. And I was always intrigued by that because the chair looked almost too fluid, as if it'd be uncomfortable or unsettling to be lying down on it.
Because of all the curves.
All the curves.
Yeah.
Rather like an alto chair, like this Paymo chair that I've got.
Did you end up sitting in that Isicon chair at some point, though?
Yes, I did.
Did that change your perception of its comfort or lack thereof?
Yeah, a little bit. I was still a little unsure about it. And there I can touch on a memory which I would do out of fondness for Ise. I had this fellowship which took me to study the work of Norman Bell Geddes, who was an industrial designer who had been a theater designer. And he was invited to send drawings to the Convegno Volta in Rome, which is the way the Gropiuses got to escape from Nazi Germany, because they'd been granted privilege to stay in England for 3 years. And they were then invited to go to Rome by the fascist leader. I forget the name of the head of the fascist party, not Mussolini, but someone else. But anyways, so Ise told the story a couple of times to me about how they actually made the trip, that they'd gone to the Convegno Volta, and then they asked the Italian authorities if they could not run the German authorities under whose flag they were still, getting passport regulation. And they asked if they could go and briefly visit in England. So they went to England, and when they're there, that's when Gropius was approached by Harvard and Hudnut to become the chair of the architecture department. And that's a whole storyline we all know was less successful than Gropius had hoped it would be. But they were released to do that, and so that's when all the possessions that are in the house were released, because when the appointment for Gropius at Harvard came through, the way Gropius has put it to the German authorities was this was in honor of German culture and an exchange. And so would they release the things that had been impounded from the Bauhaus when they moved under the temporary permit, they had to be in England for 3 years. So that's how we have the wonderful things we find in the house. In this book, which I think Ise did, that you seem to be knowledgeable, I was pleased to see I had it in my little packet.
Can you actually hold up the front of that to this camera here so we can see what that is? Yeah, this is a book that she had written about the history of the house and its construction.
Which is quite wonderful because it has reductions of the original drawings.
And actually, there's a landscape drawing in the back of that was done by Edward Nilsson, who we interviewed as part of this series.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah.
How old would he be?
Late 70s.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And he knew Ise in the 1970s. He was doing a project with her. So this is Nilsson's drawing. Yeah.
Well, wonderful to have a resource like this because of the names of some of the artists. I was intrigued by the Henry Moore was somebody who Walter got some works from Moore. I think Moore admired Walter's Bauhaus connection, although he seems to have always been fairly solitary artistic endeavor. In other words, I don't associate him with a body of artists.
I notice when you pronounce, I say Ise, that's how we say that, and you're saying Ise. And the last interview we did was with Erica, Walter Gropius's granddaughter, and she said the same. And she explained that EC is the more familiar form that the family would call her. So that,
Is that right?
makes me think that it demonstrates that you were close to the family, that you
Yeah.
would think of her name in that way.
Well, they were very generous that way, and I think they liked the sense of a family connection being sustained, because when you see what the early attempts with Alma Mahler for Walter to have any kind of stability in a romantic relationship, it was pretty unfortunate with Alma Mahler, who was a real torch. I remember at some point, I know, it was when I came back from that telling Ise, because I'd called up and I asked Ise, I found out something about the Convegno Volta and your experience back in 1934, and I want to come over and talk with you about it. Can I do that sometime? And she said, well, I'm sorry, I don't think I could really do that. And I said, oh, is there something I can do to make it less of an imposition on you? And she said, no, I'm just very unhappy to have people who knew me in the past see me now, because I'm living in the living room and I have a hospital bed in front of the bookcase. So there's a real change in the whole feeling of the space down here. And I said, oh, Ise, we've known each other for a number of years. I'm sure that I sympathize with your sensitivity, but it would mean so much to me to see you again. So she said, okay, come. And what do you want to talk about? And I said, well, part of it's about the Convegno Volta. And she said, oh, good. I'll look up, I know I've got the book here in the library. And so I came over 2 days later, and maybe she looked it up, but I don't think she did. But I came in and we chatted for a bit, and then I said, I know about Norman Bell Geddes and the Total Theater that had been designed by Gropius to make something with just sort of a machine, and it could twist the stages around and such. She said there'd been a critical audience. The theatrical people at the Convegno Volta weren't so wild about having the theater get the major attention. They were perfectly happy with standard sets rather than, adjusting seating. But Gropius made a strong defense, because he thought of the dynamic staging that would be a possibility. It would be more like movies, and of course theater was competing with movies for, common audience expansion. So she was in the living room in front of the bookcase, and her back was to the bookcase, and she said, Doug, on the third shelf down from the top, about the center of the wall, I think you'll find the publication of the Convegno Volta. And by God, there it was. And I thought, this is exactly the Ise that I knew, who was very meticulous about record keeping. And there was actually some controversy. I think they resolved it amicably enough, but Sybil Moholy-Nagy, when her husband died in, I think, 45, the photographs that she had taken of the Bauhaus had been impounded by the Germans and then been released to the Gropiuses as the responsible parties for the Bauhaus collection. And Sybil took umbrage with that. It felt that she should have been given first release or something like that. And I think they somehow did joint stewardship of the copyright. I imagine negotiating with Ise about the lineage of the Bauhaus would have been a tough battle.
Well, along those lines, I wanted to ask you about that. It seems that she was really dedicated to the Bauhaus, both early on and helping to, handling correspondence and doing networking, making connections, spreading the word. She really believed in it.
Yeah.
And then when Walter passed away, she was so diligent in keeping the legacy alive. Can you
Right.
speak to that?
Well, it had been so much of her identity. I think it was something that she anticipated before it happened, but was pleased to execute it. I remember her. The other thing, there was a guy called Walter Isaacs, who was in charge of city planning, I think at the GSD. I think that's what his interest was, who wrote about Walter and the Bauhaus. And his work was very catatonic. I mean, I remember trying to read it, thinking I'd get insights on Walter. And I felt real despair. And I talked with Ise about it and said, is there somebody else working on a biography of Walter? Because we really need a good book. We don't have one, and his reputation has suffered in consequence. And she said, no, I keep putting pressure on Mr. Isaacs to get his work done, but he always has more information that he seeks to add to the book, and then it needs to be edited out. So it sounded like a tough stretch for her.
So she seems very sensitive about how he was being portrayed in the historical record.
Right.
Having read the Fiona McCarthy book, and you mentioned the Isaacs book, do you feel that Gropius was accurately portrayed in those biographies from the man that you knew?
Well, that's what I think. McCarthy has really done a terrific job of it, because she's had the intuition or the structural cleverness to see that she could set up the book with somebody who had worked over an area and had so many cases where he wove back into the experiences of the past and the context of the past. Royer, who ends up, but he's the first student to be an instructor at the Bauhaus. And the Seska chair, and I've heard different stories about it, but it's always this question of when he got paid his first paycheck at the Bauhaus, he got 230 marks or something like that, because the inflation rate was so high. So it was a wastebasket full of marks. And he went down and he bought a bicycle because he was so ecstatic about the chrome handlebars. And then he turned that into the Seska chair. And the only difference in the lineage of that story that I can find is that some people say it was a passive observance, so that he was looking at the mailman who just had a new bicycle with the handlebars. And I always thought the story was that Breuer had bought himself something with the inflated mark. So it was a real thrill for him as a young man to get this iconic element.
Did you ever meet Breuer?
I never met Breuer. I admire his house no end, and it's too bad that it's been added on to a little, unfortunately.
Just down the road here.
Yeah.
Did you ever meet any other figures from the Bauhaus?
I don't think so. There was somebody called Yazi Sultan who worked for the CIAM, Congrès International des Architectes Modernes. But I think I know he had worked in Corb's office. I never had any contact.
Now, you mentioned, I believe you said your father was one of the people who may have put the idea of preserving the house as a museum into the family's heads. Do you remember, because you would have known them in the 70s, when Ise decided to donate the house to Spinia? Do you recall when that decision was made? Did you hear about it?
I think my father commented on it at some point, that I think he was involved in trying to find money for it to support the setting up a fund. And I'm not sure what the conditions were of the final agreement, but they were successful. But I think it was a bit of a close call whether they had enough money to maintain the house, and that's it's a responsibility that historic New England seems to execute with real diligence. But when I first moved, when I was in graduate school, Trish and I lived at the back end of the Godwin house. So we sort of lived in historic New England properties, admittedly in the servants' quarters.
And do you think that Ise made the right choice by opening that as a museum?
Oh, I think very much so.
Yeah.
I think very much
Because
so.
we mentioned the Breuer House, for example, which is also historically important, and that is just a private home.
Right. And unfortunately, I mean, I went over with a couple of other people and tried to meet with what was then the new owner some 20 years ago and alert him to the interest in the property. And it would be such a reward for the town if once or twice a year he had opened it up and, have an open house for a morning or something twice a year. And he wasn't very welcoming to the idea.
And having spent time in the Gropius House when you were younger, when it was a private home, do you think that the historic New England has accurately preserved the way that it
Oh,
looked?
I think very much so.
Yeah.
I mean, my brother Henry, who, as you noted, is a art and architecture historian, but he lived there for a month, and he said the one thing that Ise warned him about, she was visiting her sister in Germany. This is quite near the end of her life, but she had a 25-year-old toaster that she was insistent was the right size and the right look for the kitchen. But Henry said it tended to periodically set off sparks and smoke. And I thought, this is the hardship of trying to live with technology, as it always is headed towards some state of decline.
When was the last time you were in there?
I think I was there. I'm blocking for a moment. The director of the house is
Wendy Hubbard?
Wendy, yeah. And I think Wendy and I had a meeting there and a light lunch, maybe 2 springs ago.
And what does it bring up for you going into that house now?
Oh, I feel very much as if they're still present, which is very nice. Because as I hope I've communicated in some way, however imperfectly, there was a sort of a generosity and a kind of off their formal public face quality to the meetings I had with them, to the extent I had a few meetings. And that was a pleasure that I derived a great deal of interest in my work from.
It sounds like the house being in there in recent years brings back some positive memories and feelings.
And it's fun because when you go over there and you encounter people walking around, inevitably people stop and you exchange thoughts and ideas. And when you can say you actually knew the Gropiuses and remember their devotion to the house, that touches people, I think. So some sinew of connection across time.
Along those lines, having known Walter Gropius on a personal level, how does that change your perspective of him as a historical figure?
I'm not sure I've thought about that much. One of the things that I think I have a poem that a poem that my dad sent to Walter, and a letter that Walter sent back to my father. So you can sort of figure out about 1946, I think. And I've always sort of wanted to hear the voice of Walter that I think was there, but was very infrequently sounded, where he talked about the poetry of the human experience of creating architecture, which I know to be quite profound when you think you've done something clever and it works for you, like creating this, stepping down this hillside. Once we had this spine and we could identify it with a wood ceiling and double height, so you came into a room with real generosity, starting with a very conventional room up near the entry. That's the kind of thing that I would have wanted to hear more of him talking about. He did I think it was a ceramic factory in East Germany right after the end of the war, which had rather distinctive monolithic forms, a little like what Breuer might have done. And I remember thinking that I would have liked to hear how he came up with the forms, what he was really on his mind. Because in Breuer's work, he escapes it at the Whitney Museum that he designed. But when he did UNESCO, it's this huge repetitive structure without change, and it becomes a little overwhelming. It's my take on it. It's a bit more variation, as I think Alto would have done it, broke it down into more differentiated massing. That would be more in the way of my sensibility.
So you mentioned in the 1970s when you were growing up, going back to the house, and that Ise was actually a little hesitant to have you come visit because of her health, that she was living downstairs. Do you recall when she and Walter actually as well passed away, what the circumstances were around that and how that felt to you?
I remember that with Walter, it was not unexpected. He had not been well and been in hospitals. And I was privy to that through my parents, who kept up with the situation. When Ise died, it was really the end of the whole period of contact. And I remember inquiring of my father about what was happening to the house and whether that was going to complete the transfer so that it could be, a resource, a historic resource. And that was about the extent of it. So it didn't shift through the generations the way it would have, I think, more normally. In other words, I know he met with Ati and, had made in contact with her, but it wasn't frequent.
I'm sorry, your father.
My father, yeah. So that was sort of the end of it. Until it was in historic New England, and for various reasons I reached out and vice versa, and we had visited. My office is now substantially closed, but when we were a group of 8 or 10, we kept talking about doing a party for 20 people and inviting some good clients, but we just never pulled it off.
So when you mentioned that meeting with Ise later in her life, do you recall how close to her death that was? Was it close to the end?
It was 2 years.
Okay. So it's been early 80s.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk a little bit about your own architectural career. What was the first architectural job that you had when you got out of graduate school?
Let's see, on my own, the first one was for a cousin who's a wonderful friend who had bought a farmhouse of the 1800s in Petersham, Mass, up near the Woburn Reservoir. We turned it into with an addition and redoing the windows. We worked very carefully with the cattle runs that link the building into the landscape with this extensive wall work. Just amazing the amount of stones that you got off a New England farm if you pick them up for 100 years. But that was a fun commission and totally different than anything I had trained for. before that, I had worked for 5 years for Architectural Resources, Cambridge, and worked on doing the interiors of the original building for the Kennedy School of Government with one of the principals in the firm, and then did a couple of other projects that got published. It was a very good firm and a very attractive environment to work in.
And when did you start your own firm?
About a decade after, so let's see, 75 is when I think 85. But I worked for, I think that's it, 85, yeah.
And your own firm is still operating today?
Not really. I mean, I'm really a consultant. In other words, I'll work on the initial design and have somebody work on who worked in the office before. These are fairly small projects usually, although we're talking with somebody who wants to do a house and barn, who's a cabinet maker of some distinction, who we used him on a couple of our projects. He did very good work.
And what was the name of your firm?
It was called Atoll Studio, ETAL Studio. It had been under my name when I first came out of school. I worked as F. Douglas Adams for 3 or 4 years and then decided I was going to be confined to 2 small projects to be either economic or totally gratifying. So I went back and interviewed in bigger offices like Architectural Resources and joined there and worked there, thinking I might become a partner. But as it turned out, I got involved in teaching at the Rhode Island School of Design for 14 years. So to combine that design teaching with hiring for architectural practice, I found it easier to do on my own than working with the structure of a formal office where, there are competitive differences, understandably so. Who brings in more work, who does the work, which are the bigger commissions, and you have to dedicate yourself to it.
What's the origin of the name of your firm?
Atoll?
Yeah.
A really bright Turkish architect who's now teaching at New York University in Albany joined the firm. We had a large school that we were working on for 4 or 5 years, and he came up with a name when I brought him in he was going to be a co-owner. And the only difficulty he had was, of course, he had been Turkish, didn't have a whole list of client contacts. But we had hit a tough economy and we had to shrink down in size. The idea of atoll was that it could be any range of work. So we sort of invented a term.
So if you could summarize to someone what your firm does as far as its philosophy or its style in just a few sentences, what would that, let's say, tagline, for lack of a better word, be?
Let's see. Architectural design strongly linked to natural attributes of orientation and energy conservation and local environmental conditions, with a concern for fulfilling contact between professional architect and client.
Now, your brother Henry, in his wonderful book that he wrote, describes your work as responsive architecture.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
Well, in the dialogue with the clients early on in the outset, you talk about some family of building typologies that are sympathetic to what you understand about the building program. And you work forward from that, and you lay that down fairly clearly because you know it's going to evolve and change, but you want to see if you can end up returning to the thing that led the clients to make those priorities at the start of the project. So it's a way of checking the fruition of some set of ideas as they're represented in documents long before the really substantial expense of a building. So that's the way we presented our ambitions and the directives that we would bring to the design construction process.
So responsive in the sense of responding to the client's needs.
The response, the interaction between the client's stated goals and the site. And there's a lot of editing in terms of where there's conflict that client may or may not understand.
And I also, it sounds like, much like Walter Gropius, your work has been very focused on the interaction of the structure with the surrounding landscape, right, with the climate.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking responsive, maybe also in that sense, responding to the environment.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And I know that your firm, your personal work has encompassed quite a huge variety of things. For example, I know you did a car dealership in, I think, Westwood.
Yeah.
You've done private homes. You've done something as seemingly simple as a wheelchair access ramp to the Harvard president's house,
Yeah.
all the way to the Chestnut Hill School. So you've done educational projects, to a squash court and a wine cellar. So you've really been all over the map architecturally. Yeah. If you could do any kind of project you want, forget money or anything else, what kind of building would you like to design?
Interestingly, I sort of think a gym complex would be intriguing, a sports facility. So you get to deal with all these links to the outside and inside environments, conditioned environments, whether they're pools or squash courts or basketball courts or whatever.
And the squash court that you did would be an opportunity to...
Yeah, which was a very good project. I take a real pleasure. I go back there about once a year just to see on a weekend the intensity of enthusiasm of the young people playing the sports and the skill that goes into sports now. I mean, I was a pretty good athlete, captained a couple of teams. But, the training that kids receive nowadays, I mean, I think there's maybe a little bit too much of it. But on the other hand, if you delight in the sport, to know the way to improve is, altogether to the best.
So it sounds like because you yourself have a lifelong interest in athletics,
yeah,
that project would be particularly meaningful in the sense of giving people a place to engage in that. And
right.
Where is that located, that squash court?
That's in Concord, Mass.
We've mentioned your brother Henry a couple of times in this book that he wrote. Can you describe briefly your relationship with him? Seems like you're very close.
Well, that's fun. We've become terrific friends over 70 years, but for the first 20 years, he was very bookish, and I was a reasonably good scholar, but I was very actively pursuing sports with my older brother, who was 4 years older. He was a gifted athlete and a very analytical athlete. So with Henry, it's been, after we got out of college, we started to spend more time with each other and discuss things and share ideas and critique things in common. So that's been a real pleasure, as any good friendship is.
And it seems like he's really supportive and passionate about your work and sharing that information with people.
Yeah, he's a very interesting guy.
What was it like creating that book with him?
Oh, it was great fun working on the book. Our one regret was that things changed, interventions in his life and mine, where we became busier. I've got this Parkinson's disease now. So that made it hard for me to sort of wrap things up in a timely way. And so there are 4 projects we very much wanted to have in the book that to get in, and probably won't now.
What's the name of that book that we're referring to?
The one of the F.D. Adams architect.
Was that made commercially available?
I've sent out to friends who do they want a book of projects the office did. And usually if their project is in it, I mention that. And then say, we'll send the book if you are so generous to want to pay $25 for it. That's about what it costs.
How do you see the Bauhaus philosophy reflected in your own work?
Total design. That's simple. I mean, I think the sense of the Bauhaus was almost anything that you needed to make, you could take a component of design and link it into other things that you were making. And that's an aptitude that I think I believe in.
The Bauhaus valued collaboration between disciplines, and that carried over as well to TAC, the Architects Collaborative, right? By name, obviously. How's collaboration played out in your work?
Well, I always had partners until the last decade or so. That makes it more fun. There's always some component for misunderstandings and friction about values or cost or something like that. But as you become more experienced, you become more skilled at letting those be things that you confront, you deal with. And obviously, if you deal with them in a way that resolves it adequately for both parties, then you're both better served. So, that's the wisdom that I bring to it after 50 years of practice.
So let's bring it down to just a few more questions about really the legacy and the lessons that have come to us through Walter Gropius. I'm curious, if he were alive today, what challenges do you think that he would best or most want to tackle with his philosophy?
I think he'd be a strong environmentalist. I think that would be a stronger claim in his work than what it was. I think he'd be interested as to what we do. I mean, right now we've got a crazy culture. We've got. I just found out that my nephew bought a new house, a small house out in Illinois, for some $300,000 or so. That's for a young couple. That's a hardship. And right now, politically, the country doesn't seem to be able to make any wise judgments for a vast majority of the affected. It's only the very rich. And of course, that's a hyper inflated game. What with the amount that is speculative in artificial intelligence as in meta and other conditions of life, and we accept it because we pretty much have to. But I've just got a new Apple operating system delivered to my phone. Not that I requested, but because they deliver it. And what I notice about it is it's linking into any number of things, all of which are transactional, all of which generate revenue for Apple. And I resent that on my phone. I'd like to have a device that doesn't do anything other than what I wish to direct it to do. It's a little Orwellian to my standard.
So given that Gropius was always an advocate for utilizing modern technology, what do you think he would feel about a technology like that, or about AI?
That's an excellent secretary. I don't really know. But I think the question of things that are generated that may have unattractive consequences, certainly some of the media information is very real. I mean, what apparently it has an effect on teenagers and young adolescents, just the exposure to media is disquieting, and what it seems to yield as a consequence. So I'm very hesitant about it.
And again, as we think about AI, on the one hand, Gropius was an advocate for using modern technology like the machine, right, to mass produce things, to make them more efficient, more affordable, right? AI can do that. It can make things more efficient,
Yeah.
more affordable. But at the same time, Gropius really celebrated creativity, and AI in some ways seems like a threat to that. We'll see how it plays out. But
I think that's an awfully interesting subject to sit around in a circle and be able to talk with a group of others and frame it a little bit. But I mean, I think the thing Walter tried to escape and always got tied down a little by it was to what extent technology, as he was understanding it and pursuing it, meant you had more and more of the same thing. And the selective understanding of modernization, of standardization that Alto was working at was one where you would still have a series of choices, and the idea was that you would opt to execute those choices and find a new rationale that then added value to the work in totality. That's an ideal. But certainly when he was dealing with theaters and places of assembly, that's the shaping that he took the projects through.
what do you think young designers and planners should most take away from Gropius's legacy and lessons?
I would have said the concern for a validly beneficial social policy to the benefit of the majority of people.
So sort of that socially conscious
Yeah.
way of seeing things.
Yeah.
The
extent to which we've privatized social conscience concerns me. I mean, as far as I can understand it, what this current administration has done with the Kennedy Center and places like that just appall me. The withdrawal of funding from some of the great educational institutions like Harvard appalls me, because I have no illusion that the money is going to anything nearly approximate in value socially. And I think it's going to end up, when you look at what research scientists have lost in terms of grant programs that allow them to do highly speculative but really primary research work, to give that up and let some other culture do it in advance of us seems to be lunacy. And I think it just completely misshapen.
This is a pretty big topic that I don't want to get into because we are winding things down, but I'm curious, at least just on a simpler level. It's bringing to mind something I think about, which is how Gropius and many of these modernists in the early 20th century had very socially conscious ideas, as we're talking about now. Think of the Fagus factory that Gropius designed, right, to bring light into these working conditions, right, make working conditions better, and to make these human-centered design choices in homes and developments and so on. But at the same time, a couple decades later, modernism was kind of the underpinnings of urban renewal in mid-century period, in which whole neighborhoods were being destroyed and communities displaced in order to rebuild them. And Corbusier, for example, this garden city type of concept, putting high rises up, getting rid of everything old. It's kind of a tough contradiction to reconcile, right?
It's an inheritance that I'm not sure one wants to be limited to.
I'm sorry, can you say that again?
It's an inheritance that I'm not sure one wants to be limited to. In other words, I think community planning and urban design still hasn't figured out whether there's an ideal scale to work at in terms of community schools, residential complexes, open field systems, that sort of stuff. Is the ideal community 50,000 or less? There must be some module like that. And maybe this way you can put 2 or 3 cities together, 50,000, so that you get a flow of different grain, so you get a variety out of it. Just don't know, I haven't given that much thought. But it seems like every time we try to do something, the final result ends up much more expensive than what people thought going into it.
This is kind of a big question too, but it's another thing that I ponder. So Gropius, maybe wrongly, is often framed as wanting to make a clean break from the past, right? Looking at these old styles like Beaux-Arts and saying, well, this is outdated. It doesn't fit the modern times. We need to start fresh, right? Especially after the war, after World War I, create a new way of thinking and designing for the modern times. So he was very much in this forward motion perspective of let's create what's current and what's needed now. And here we are 100 or so years after the Bauhaus, and here we are talking about it and celebrating it and talking about how great the designs are. Do you think that Gropius, with that mentality of moving forward, would say, hey, you know what? The past this is 100 years old. Embrace what's happening now. Would he advocate for kind of a clean break from his own philosophy?
I think what he'd be assessing, I'm not sure what he would do, but I think what he'd be assessing is, can you make a better space for the thing that you're trying to do that's new by doing something new, or can you actually renovate? For instance, the firm I worked with, Architectural Resources, did the Hall of Languages at Syracuse University and got an AIA gold medal for it. And it was a total gut out of the inside of a building, leaving the bearing walls and the facade and the fenestration pretty much as they were. But you got some very interesting juxtapositions. And that was because the interior had been so abused over its longevity of 80 years that there wasn't any value in going back and restoring it. So we put a new interior into the building. There's an example where I think we thought we created just as many classrooms and lecture rooms and conditions of use that the client needed in a reconstruction that was pretty total. And of course, you got some different fabric. You have good stonework and brickwork and stuff, which was worth saving because it was cost effective to save it rather than to replicate it.
So this conception again of Gropius having a clean break from the past, that term gets used a lot, and I said I qualified that as being rightly or wrongly that's how he's perceived. Yeah. Do you think that that's true, that he was just always about move forward, or that really he was maybe more pragmatic about, well, in some cases that's what you need to do because it fits modern needs, and in other cases maybe preservation is the right thing?
Yeah, and I don't know whether his work at the end of his career, whether he was old enough to really be caught up in the renovation work, which in terms of urban planning and such, we viewed the mature city of the 19th century as being a very real fulfillment of urban potential. You look at Boston, you semi-basement spaces that make lots of good walk-up businesses. The finer grain you have to now solve that problem with is to assess accessibility and be sensitive to that, which is a real challenge. We did a lot of work, being new work, renovation, addition. You always ended up having to make the whole finished product, handicapped accessible. And one of the things they pointed out, which was very interesting, I had some interesting discussions and frankly disagreements with some of the state regulators about disability access, which is by modifying it and simplifying it in some ways, like instead of unisex bathrooms, to have gang bathrooms, which is the appropriate number of, say you need 8 fixtures, you do 5 or 6 gang bathrooms, but then you do 2 individual bathrooms. So if people want to use just a completely separate volumetric space, that doubles as inaccessible. It's designed about accessibility. So you suddenly, it changes what you can do. You can renovate over spaces. And that's a big cost efficiency if you can get formal agreement.
It sounds like these are challenges architects are always going to face, right? Is
Yeah.
what to save, what to renovate, what to tear down and build fresh.
Yeah.
And is this something that you've thought about a lot in your own work?
Well, thought about it because it's a civil rights violation if you don't do it right by the standard of counts and programming, as well as the details of dimensional construction.
And we're talking about the accessibility issue.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So we've talked a lot about Walter Gropius's legacy. So as we finish here, I would ask you, how about your own legacy? What do you hope to have left for future generations?
Well, I guess some well-wrought, enduring physical work, which has the benefit of good ownership that allows it to be well maintained and sustained over time.
Is there anything that I should have asked you that I didn't?
No, I think it's been pretty complete and sort of a pleasure to talk about, particularly in the context of thinking about Ise and Walter. I mean, one of the things I always asked myself about Ise and Walter was somehow Walter always ended up being the head of a fairly large-scale operation, so he had to delegate a great deal of what he wanted to do. And was that really what his sensibility directed him, was his most fulfilling balance of work? Or would he, like, for instance, somebody like Alto never had more than 20 people in his office, and 4 or 5 of those people were mature, long-enduring members of the staff. That's a commitment to a long relationship and the notion of evolving transition in terms of goals and gateways. So it's just a different likelihood instead of a big, and you look at Richard Rogers or somebody like that who's got an office, 5 offices, a total of 1,000 people or something. I mean, he doesn't know anything about most of the work of his office, but it's under his aegis. I don't quite understand that.
So are you speculating that you think Gropius maybe would have preferred to have a more, let's say, intimate connection with the goings-on?
I wonder.
You wonder?
I have no clue, really. But I mean, TAC went, because of all the work it did in Saudi Arabia and in the Mediterranean region, and it killed the firm ultimately because they grew to handle the work when it was stable society, albeit archaically stable. And then it quickly collapsed under the pressure of the oil market and OPEC and all these other things. And that was a rapid death. I mean, there are a lot of people who retired in careers and thought they had benefits going forward for many years, and they just disappeared.
Did your firm or in your work, did you have connections with tech?
No.
No. Well, and if there's nothing else, I think we'll leave it there.
Well, thanks so much.
Great. Thank you, Doug.
Thank
It's been
you,
a pleasure.
Anna. Thank you.